Today we will be looking at bankruptcy filing trends by chapter in the state of Oklahoma. To do this, we have about a dozen charts showing bankruptcy activity in the state going back to 1990. All of this filing data comes from the Administrative Office of the United States Courts. This first chart shows total filings by year since 1990 in the state. During that time, there have been about 440,000 cases filed in Oklahoma. In the early 1990s, filings were running about 13,000 to 15,000 per year. This jumped up to a little over around 20,000 per year in the late 1990s. By the early 2000s, 25,000 per year was more the typical range. Big jump in 2005, the year of bankruptcy reform, followed by a more than 80% drop the next year. And then filings rebounded somewhat as the recession came on, but even there, never got close to where they were in the years prior to bankruptcy reform, and were about where they had been back in 1990. Since then, filings are down by around 40%, and so in 2015, filings in Oklahoma were less than half of where they were from, say, 1996 to 2005, and even well below where they were back in 1990. Most states had about the same rate in 2015 as 1990, but Oklahoma is quite a bit below that. This map shows filings relative to population in the states, and over time, Oklahoma has been about 16% above the national average. And the states colored red have the highest bankruptcy rates, and Tennessee is the perennial leader in that. The states with the lowest bankruptcy rates, including a lot of New England, are colored yellow. And actually, the place with the lowest rate almost every year has been Alaska. But Oklahoma's been somewhat above average, but not an outlier as some of these other states. If we look at this year by year, and the blue is Oklahoma, and the red is the national average, you can see that from 1990 to 2005, Oklahoma was well above average every year, and during this time, the rate was about 1/3 above the national average. In the last decade, from 2006 to 2015, Oklahoma's actually averaged about 15% below the national average. So they've gone from a fairly high bankruptcy rate to fairly low compared over the last couple of decades. This chart shows total Chapter 7 filings in the state by year, and it's the same basic pattern as with total filings, where you had 10 to 12,000 filings in the early 90s, about 18,000 per year in the late 90s, got up to over 20,000 in the early 2000s. Big spike in 2006, 85% drop in 2006 compared to 2005. Filings rebounded somewhat with the recession, but were half of where they were prior to bankruptcy reform, and even a little bit below where they'd been in 1990, and then have dropped since then, so that now in 2015, filings are down at least 1/3 from where they were back in 1990, and 2/3 from the years prior to bankruptcy reform. Looking at Chapter 11 cases in the state, you can see there's a decline throughout the 1990s, and this happened pretty much in every state. Since then, typically you get about 20 to 40 cases per year, but definitely more during the recession. Most of these are filed in the Western District of Oklahoma, and it looks like 2016 there'll be about 35 or so filed statewide. Chapter 12 filings in the state throughout the 1990s were running 30 to 60 per year. In 2000 to 2004, There's many periods in here that Chapter 12 was not available, but still, when it was, the filing stayed up in Oklahoma. But since then have dropped quite a bit and are now averaging around 10 per year. So it's quite a bit below where it had been in the early 1990s. And there's really not that many Chapter 12s filed nationwide now. It's generally around 400 to 500 per year. Chapter 13 filings in the state in the early 90s were running a little over 2,000 per year. They kind of spiked up from 1996 to 1998. And I'm really not sure what happened. There's several other western states like Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, New Mexico also showed big spikes in Chapter 13 activity, followed by drop-off since then. And so I'm not sure what went on there, because it didn't happen in all the western states, but some of them. From 1999 to 2005, they were running about 3,000 per year. Dropped off in 2006, more so than most other places, actually. Went up somewhat in the recession, but still were well below the peak. Most states actually had their peak around 2010, and then have dropped off since then. So right now, Chapter 13s in the state are about where they were back in 1990, about half of where they were in the early 2000s, and 40% or so where they were in the late 1990s when they really spiked in Oklahoma. Looking at the percent of cases filed as Chapter 13, nationwide, the rate has run at 30% for a number of years, or very close to it. Some disruption before and after bankruptcy reform, and it is heading up a little bit now. But generally, it's followed the 30% line pretty closely. In Oklahoma, the rate has been more in the 10 to 20% range. Starting at 10%, jumping up to nearly 20% around the time they spiked in Oklahoma, then falling back down into the 10% range, and in recent years around 15 to 17%. In 2015, there are some differences statewide. The Northern District in 2015, about 12% of the cases were Chapter 13, and the Eastern District is only 10%, and the Western District was 21%. Now, this chart shows the unemployment rate by quarter in Oklahoma since 2006, and it's kind of a proxy of how the economy has been going. And you can see that Oklahoma's been below the average every quarter up until middle of 2016, and during the recession, when the national rate got up to nearly 10%, Oklahoma peaked out at about 7%. They've both fallen down, but in the last year and a half, trended up a little bit in Oklahoma, while the national is still continuing to drop. So for the first time in 10 years, it's higher in Oklahoma than the rest of the country. Now, bankruptcy filings most recently peaked in the year ended September of 2010. Since then, filings are down by about 49% nationwide. The smallest declines, states colored yellow here, have been mostly in the northeast, or the southeast, and states that have a lot of Chapter 13 cases. The biggest declines of over 60% have occurred in a good part of New England and the Southwest and a few other states, and particularly Nevada and California are both down about 70%. In Oklahoma, the decline has been a little below average, about 41%, and actually the Northern District is down 46%, the Eastern down 43%, and the Western down 37%. So if we had run this map by judicial district, the Western District would be colored yellow too. Looking at it quarter by quarter, Oklahoma's generally followed the national pattern. You see that for most quarters, the national, the red line here, is been between 10 and 15%, but the rate of decline has been slowing down. Most quarters it was more in the 10% range for Oklahoma, with there, some ups and downs. Right now we've got kind of an unclear pattern in that a quarter up, a quarter down, and it's not real clear where this is leading. But in the first 6 months of the year, nationwide there was a 5.9% decline, which is much less than what it had been in other years. In Oklahoma, it was down by only 0.1%, so it's just really a couple of cases. The states in red are states that actually have showed an increase in the first half of 2016, and there's about a dozen of them. And if we'd looked at this 2 years ago, there wouldn't have been any red states. And if we look at it 2 years from now, I would think that most states will be showing some increase, and including Oklahoma. In the third quarter, there's about a 5% increase in the state, and which means by the end of the year, when we redo this map, Oklahoma will be in the red states. So I think the overall look is that there'll be about 9,300 cases filed in the state of Oklahoma this year. Modest increases in the coming years. I don't see any return to the 25,000 per year that were filed in the early 2000s without some sort of bankruptcy legislation or another major recession. Well, that concludes our look at bankruptcy filings in Oklahoma. For more statistical information and other information on bankruptcy, be sure to visit the newsroom section of the ABI website at www.abi.org.